Help me greet Roger Bernard. Roger.
Thank you very much, Ron. I was thinking about telling you some political jokes, but the problem is I've seen too many of them elected. So I'm going to hold off on that for right now. We're going to go through a lot of stuff here this afternoon real quick for you. I know everything that you've talked about and heard about today are things you can all apply right directly to your operation. Well, the information I'm going to give you are things that are going to affect your operation and going to affect your potential for profitability too. They're not maybe things that you can go out there and look in that cattle yard and see, or out in that lot, out in that pasture, but these are things that are going to be impacting your business at some point. As we look at our U.S. economy, first off, as Ron said, take about a 30,000-foot view here. Our U.S. economy, the last reading on the fourth quarter of last year, up to about now 1%. Still puts us at about 2.4% growth for last year. Now moving ahead, we were hoping to see a lot better economy. But over the course of the last 6 to 8 months, we've had to bring down our expectations of where we think this U.S. economy is headed. Now why does that get into your business? Because hitting the button here, that's my bad. I got to take my hand out of my pocket here. It gets into the people that buy your product. And if they're not as confident about their situation, they're not going to go out and spend near as much money. So our economy, what we're looking at now is probably something around a 2.5% growth rate, which is basically right where we've been at for the last 2 to 3 years. A really kind of a slow growth, not the kind of big growth that you'd really like to see. Part of that has been the consumer has been very reluctant to be out there spending a lot of money. You can't fault people for saving money, but at the same token, the U.S. consumer drives about 60 to 70% of the U.S. economy. So if they're putting more money in their pocket and not deploying it out into the economy, that makes it a lot harder for our country to grow in terms of how fast our economy produces. Also, it makes businesses reluctant to invest. Businesses are sitting on a lot of cash right now because they're uncertain about the future as well. So we've got kind of a situation where we're, again, just seeing sort of a slow, steady growth rate. It's not bad, but boy, it sure could be a lot better. China, a lot of attention. Y'all turn on the news just about every day, you hear about the markets going up or down because of what's happening in China. They are a major consumer in the world. So what happens in their economy does bleed back through right to the United States. Now, as the Chinese economy has slowed considerably, their growth rate last year was just under 7%. Now, everybody thinks, boy, 7%, that'd be great. Well, they're coming down off of double-digit growth rates. They haven't set their growth target for this coming year yet, but it's probably going to be somewhere under 7% once again. So China is struggling with an economy in their eyes and in their situation as they're transitioning away from an agrarian society to more of an urban society. As they make this transition, they have to keep that economy performing so that those people moving off the farm, it's very slow, they have a job in a city or in a location that will pay them money. As their money and as their wages increase, that increases their buying power. As more of their consumers move into the middle class, that helps out demand for commodities. So that Chinese economy is one to keep a close eye on. When you're looking at Japan, they've been coming through 1 to 2, or some people say 3 decades now, that almost are lost decades. Very slow growth. You've seen their central bank deploy negative interest rates to try to spur their economy, to try to get people, to try to get businesses not to be keeping their cash, but to start deploying it into their economy to get some expansion going. Then the European Union has been very slowly coming out of their malaise. They've been making some strides. Their fortunes are also quite heavily tied to China. We're all customers of China. Several countries around the globe are very key customers. The United States, the European Union bloc of countries in particular. Their banking and financial sector has gone through a lot of upheaval. They're also in that potential negative interest rate category, trying to deploy more stimulus to get those 28 countries that are part of the EU moving forward economically. Then we get to the emerging countries around the world. Now these are nations that are very dependent on the commodity side of the equation. We've seen the commodity price downturns. That starts translating back through to how those economies are struggling. The fiscal and monetary policies deployed by developed countries like the United States and others start impacting those economies. Again, when you've got a series of countries around the globe that are not growing as fast as they possibly could, that starts creating some economic headwinds, and that starts causing issues for countries like the United States, where we rely on those other countries for part of our economic performance. The currency situation, the US dollar has been strong. That's really eaten into US competitiveness around the globe. And then we've also got the situation that's coming up and that's going to get more and more attention in the next few years, and that's our deficit and debt situation. So in a nutshell, we've got, like I said, a slow-growing economy that needs to pick up the pace in order to help out a lot of other parts. The dollar has definitely increased. It's caused a lot of issues. We had international trade data out this morning on trade in goods, a little bit higher of a deficit than we expected to see. Also this week, USDA just updated their forecast for U.S. ag exports. They've now dialed it back to $126 billion for the value of exports and took some more off the value of imports, leaving us with a trade surplus. And agriculture still registers a positive on the trade balance. A trade surplus of about $6.5 billion. That's the lowest that we've seen since fiscal year 2006. But this dollar has caused a lot of issues for U.S. commodities and a lot of other markets. Now, conversely, countries like Brazil, again, competitors to the United States, their currency has been lower. So they have enjoyed some advantage over U.S. supplies in different markets around the globe. So it's an issue that is continuing to be out there. And as this dollar stays up, it continues to crimp our ability to export. That's been one of the factors that's held back beef exports over the last year. Also pork continues to be held back by this stronger U.S. dollar. It's up 17% since about the middle of 2014. We've had a little bit of a come off of the dollar here recently. Could be a sign that we might have had a short-term top in here to bring it back down a little bit. That will help out our competitiveness. As I mentioned, the lower interest rates that are being deployed by other central banks around the globe, and recall our U.S. Fed raised interest rates, or raised that range of their Fed funds rate by a quarter point last December. The U.S. trade, and it's also impacting our economy because that stronger dollar also makes it less expensive for us to import goods into this country. That's where we start running into that trade deficit situation because those goods are cheaper to bring in, and that starts creating issues for our gross domestic product, our economy, because an import that comes into this country is a negative for U.S. economic growth because that's not a product being consumed here that was produced here. There will be eventual pressure also coming on the dollar from the federal budget and the trade deficit as things start to materialize. Now, the energy sector, this area of the world in particular, y'all don't need to have me telling you about the energy sector and the struggles facing there. It's been relatively good news for consumers because they've enjoyed lower gasoline prices, but again, they've not deployed those dollars that they're saving at the pump into this U.S. economy in a great way. There's been a lot of theories about that, and I don't think anybody's hit on the solution as to why they've done that. It's possibly that they're somewhat reluctant in terms of their own economic situation to deploy more of their dollars into the economy, and because maybe they've seen this movie before and decide now's the time to build up a little bit of a war chest. Because recall, we're coming out of a pretty deep recession in this country, and people maybe took a page from agriculture in the 1980s when we saw the housing crisis hit in 2008, 9, et cetera, and people got upside down in loans and mortgages and things like that. Well, maybe they've taken a page from agriculture's history and said, we need to get our debt situation pared down. We need to get our, more savings so we can better weather some of these storms. But whatever it is, it's still having an impact. The oil exporting countries are now finally starting to get, this has got their attention. And it's got the market's attention. You're down around $30, for U.S. crude, getting about $35 for Brent crude out of Europe. And the latest pop-up that we got in prices, you got Venezuela now talking about they want to meet with Russia, a couple of the other oil-producing countries, to talk about stabilizing the market situation. The keys to watching all of this are the Saudis. They have floated a proposal talking about freezing production at January levels. Well, keep in mind, OPEC's been producing above their quota. So when they're talking about freezing it, they're not really talking about reducing production necessarily. But watch the Saudi Arabians and how they react to the market situation. They've already pulled back some of their subsidies that they pay to their consumers. So they're starting to feel a little bit of this hit. But Venezuela is one of the players that started to get really interested in righting this oil market because their break-even cost of production on crude, at least of about 6-8 months ago, was somewhere north of $100 a barrel. So when we're talking about crude where it's at, that's really starting to hurt countries like Venezuela, some of those smaller oil-producing nations. So we're looking right now, probably crude oil prices, in this range of about $30 probably. The supply cuts that have gone on, because these low prices have brought down our shale oil production in this country. The latest rig count out this afternoon, again, showed another downturn. These production cuts that are taking place here in the United States are going to eventually ease downward pressure on oil prices. Again, watch the Saudis. And if you're looking at your natural gas costs, those are probably going to be pretty even, not going to be something that's going to be increasing your cost situation, especially as we've had a relatively mild winter in a lot of places of this country this year. On the ethanol side, renewable fuel standard, you're going to see some attempts at making changes to it, but the renewable fuel standard, at least legislatively, is not going to change. Now, there may be some court issues. There's been, somewhere in the neighborhood of half dozen to a dozen suits filed over the renewable fuel standard by people on both sides of the issue. So nobody's happy. That might tell you it's actually a pretty good policy. If nobody's happy about it, it might actually not be too bad, because if one group is cheering about it, then you know somebody else's ox is going to get gored. So there's not going to be any major changes on that renewable fuel standard, but it's already worked its way into the presidential politics, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. Washington accomplishments. There haven't been a whole lot necessarily the last 6-8 months. We did get the debt limit hike taken care of. The 2-year spending package was agreed to last year. The spending and the tax extender details were agreed to. The Section 179 expensing is permanent. The bonus depreciation gets stepped down over the course of the next few years. It's at 50% and then stair steps down from there into about 2018-19. So you've still got some time to use that, but that Section 179 is now permanent. So you've got that to count on. You don't have to wait till the end of the year to see if Congress is going to go ahead and renew it once again. And so you got to save all your receipts all year long and hope they're going to do it. Now that is there. So at least we got, something positive and actually permanent coming out of Washington. The trade deficit situation. This is going to start working into what's going on. As you can see, the forecasts are going out. We're going to see that trade deficit continuing to increase. This stronger dollar is not going to help that situation. But what does the policy implication for this trade deficit? It starts to create more drive for trade deals like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement with the Pacific Rim countries, and also that trade and investment partnership with the European Union. It's these kinds of things that start driving the interest, the policy interest, in what's going on around the world. A trade deficit will get people's attention and start to get people to focus on trade policy in order to address that trade situation. Now, our deficit and debt woes, this is something Congress is really pretty good at, is just kicking that big old can down the road. Well, it's starting to get to be a pretty big can. As you can see, these projections right now, the first budget of the next president, is going to have a worse deficit situation to play with than our current administration. And the next 4 years beyond that is going to continue to be a struggle. Well, how does this start getting back in? Because this starts bringing budget cuts back into the equation for policy. And that includes farm policy. Everything gets looked at, or most everything gets looked at when we start to get talking about the deficit and debt situation. Now already, you've got spending bills being worked through on Congress, but they're still stuck on a couple other issues before they even get to that point. But the deficit situation is one that's going to start translating back through again to the policy side. Our national debt also is going to be increasing very rapidly over the next few years if things don't change. If the spending picture is not adjust, you're going to start seeing an increase of $9 to $10 trillion in the coming years, and that's going to start making it into a greater percentage of our GDP. When you start thinking about all this, as we finance this, what does the government do? They sell bonds. Well, if we're starting to look at higher interest rates on those bonds, what does that do? That starts raising the cost of financing that debt and deficit. In fiscal 2015, about 50% of the spending, roughly, was in net interest on the debt, on Medicare and Medicaid, Obamacare, and Social Security. Now, the projections right now, as we get out to 2020, you're going to see that climb to about 63% of spending. These are areas that are deemed as sort of mandatory spending. So that means if they're looking at cutting something, they've got to look at the discretionary side. That piece of that pie is starting to get even smaller. That means there's less and less wiggle room. That means entitlement reform has got to come into play at some point. Legislative outlook, as we're looking forward, there's very few bills that are actually going to get through this Congress because we're getting into campaign mode already. And you're not going to see a lot of activity. In fact, you're probably looking at something where you get much past July, you're not going to see a lot happen in Washington, D.C. Sometimes that's not a bad thing, okay? But you don't always want to see that to be a permanent situation. But very few bills are going to get passed. One of the most important things, perhaps, that's happened is the death of Supreme Court Justice Scalia. That has caused some major impacts in Washington. Already, you've got the Republican leadership in the Senate saying we are not going to consider a nomination. But what happens with things like this? This now leaves our Supreme Court with 8 members. That means we're looking at potentials for 4-4 ties in some of these cases that may come up before the Supreme Court. That could include things like waters of the U.S. That could include other very important things like the immigration reform. So what happens if you get 4-4 tie? The previous court's decision stands. So that's why this Supreme Court justice situation could be a major game changer for Washington, for policy, for regulation as we move along. We did get the annual transportation funding bill. You could see some politics come into play at that in the end of the year. Look for a lame duck session to come along. That's what's going to happen. Probably you're going to see something post-election to deal with some of the things that they haven't dealt with because of all the politics and the political discussions. Floor amendments are always important when you start looking at things and how those all get melded into what's going on. Right now, we'd give probably about a 50% chance you're going to see another one of those big omnibus spending packages. Paul Ryan, Speaker of the House, when he took over, said, I'm not going to do one of those. His chamber has started in on considering each one of those spending bills. The Senate also is holding hearings on that. The only thing is, they haven't necessarily set the budget resolution. Now, what that budget resolution does is kind of set that pool of money that they can spend on these individual areas. Well, if they're not going to do that, that sort of leaves a question mark out. What's going on is the conservative side of the Republican Party wants about a $30 billion reduction in that spending side. The Democrats are not going to go along with that. especially in election years, so you've got a standoff already right there on the budget resolution. Are we going to get tax reform? No, not this year. You're going to get some hints at it, some things maybe around the edges, but look more at 27 to 2018. And one of the things, obviously, that's going to be important for agriculture is going to be that investment tax credit as well. So most of the things that are going on in Washington are probably going to be on hold because of the politics side. Regulation and barriers, though, those are not on hold. There's going to be more executive orders coming up. This administration has made it clear they're going to do that. They're not backing off. EPA Administrator McCarthy has made it clear that she thinks many of their regulations are going to stand up to court challenges. But here again, this is where that Supreme Court situation becomes very important. The Clean Power Plan, WOTUS, etc., those end up with 4-4 ties. If it advanced to the Supreme Court, that means that lower court ruling stands. So this 4-4 situation on the court is going to be important. That WOTUS rule, we do see it ending up in the courts, ending up being decided in the courts. The Sixth Circuit has decided they've got jurisdiction, but the 11th Circuit wants to see what the Sixth Circuit does, and there could also be some others enter into the fray. So we're not yet in a real solid situation necessarily on that WOTUS rule, but the courts are where it's going to happen. You could get it very easily through the House of Representatives. EPA Administrator McCarthy was up before the House Agriculture Committee here about a week and a half ago. And I've watched Congress for 30 years almost. I have never seen an administrator of a government agency tell lawmakers, I'll get back to you, as many times as she did during that hearing. And she was getting criticism not just from the Republican side of the aisle. Democrats were on her as well. One of the key issues they focused in on, Representative David Scott, Democrat from Georgia. He cornered McCarthy on the GAO report, which said basically EPA broke the law with their Twitter campaign that they're for clean water. The problem that GAO said was, well, once that gets retweeted, and I love this, so we got the government office talking about tweeting, but they said once that gets retweeted, there's nothing that says it came from EPA. That was the problem they had with it. Representative David Scott simply turned to Administrator McCarthy and said, own up to it. You broke the law. Let's come clean. And that's a Democrat telling that to his party's administrator of the EPA. So on the House side, you've got very bipartisan angst and anger over EPA regulations. Senate side, you've got not near enough support there because this administration stopped a provision to rein in that WOTUS rule that could have come in that 2-year budget package that was agreed to last December. The Democrats in the Senate kept that from being in that package. So getting something on EPA through the Senate to curtail WOTUS, to suspend it even further, to remove it, is going to be a tough uphill battle ahead. So let's get into the fun stuff. The political side of things is definitely getting a lot more interesting as we've been moving forward. It's kind of one of those things where, is this a reality show or what, folks? I mean, the volume that's been involved and everything that's going on. On the Republican side, you've got the anti-Washington, Mr. Trump, definitely in that category, Mr. Cruz as well, and then you've got the establishment. Right now, that's John Kasich and Marco Rubio are basically the two establishment candidates that are probably out there. The Democrats, of course, we've got the liberal side, and we've got the socialist Democrat that's out there. And there's a lot of what-ifs that come into play when we start looking at what's going on in this whole situation. What if Hillary Clinton falters and Bernie Sanders gains a lot more traction? Could that bring Joe Biden back into the mix? Now, it's going to have to happen pretty quick if something like that's going to take place, but don't rule that out, because what has Joe Biden said very consistently? That's the decision he regrets the most, not jumping into this race. The Republicans' what-ifs. What if no Republican has enough delegates when we arrive at that convention in Cleveland to outright claim that nomination? It's a possibility. The odds are a lot less than they were, but it's a possibility. And don't forget, if we, heaven forbid, if we get something like a terrorist situation go on, that could be a game changer in this election process as well. If the economy continues to falter, that might boost Mr. Trump. A lot of people think he's a pretty good businessman. Let's put him in charge of the economy. Now, the vice presidential candidates, that's one that's going to enter into the picture a lot later down the road, okay? There's a wide batch of choices. I mean, who here back in 1988 could have imagined that Dan Quayle was going to end up as vice president? Frankly, who in this room could imagine that Joe Biden was going to end up as vice president? So that tells you the vice president situation, there's a wide number of choices. A lot of people yet to be picked in terms of that. But right now, this pro-change mood is what's supporting things. Donald Trump is also getting some resonation out in the countryside of let's make America great again. Now, who does that sound like? Well, let's get this country going. You know, Ronald Reagan. That's what it's conjuring up with some people. And so that's why he's garnering some attention. Now, this would argue for a Republican president. But our Republicans are potentially flirting with some self-destruction maybe, depending on how everything shakes out. Now, so you've got, of course, Donald Trump. And of course, coming from, I live in north central Iowa, so I couldn't be up here without this one to go along with you. And on the Democratic side, yes, you've got Bernie. And I don't believe he will be the nominee unless Hillary gets indicted or investigated for her email situation. That's where you could see maybe Mr. Biden somehow come back into the mix. But he's already, again, forced her a lot more left than she would have been. Because recall, her husband, yeah, we're going to do that big trade agreement thing, We saw him, he was all for trade. Well, his wife has now come out against the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. As far as the outlook for TPP, not going to happen before the elections. Senator Mitch McConnell already says not going to bring it up for a vote in the Senate before that, so forget about it until after the elections. That puts it into a lame duck session, or if the Democrats should happen to take control of the U.S. Senate, he may just say, here you go, you got it, and leave it up to the Democrats to approve or try to get TPP approved in the U.S. Senate. But it's not going to happen before the elections. All right, now but don't get too fixated on just the presidential elections. There's a few other things going on too. U.S. Senate races. Coming up, the Republicans have about twice as many seats to defend this time around as do the Democrats. That could argue that it's very tough to possibly win all those seats. You could see potentially the Senate slip back into Democratic control, but that would probably only get you 2 years because in 2018, the tables flip. Democrats will have nearly twice as many seats to defend as the Republicans. Now, that control of the Senate could loom very large, especially whoever wins the White House. Because, of course, you get ties in the Senate. If it's that close of a margin in the Senate, then your vice president becomes a tiebreaker. But those Senate elections, don't lose sight of those as that election night unfolds. The other thing, the Supreme Court, if we get any other openings. We have got 3 justices on the Supreme Court that are 77 years or better. That's, you're getting into that risky territory. So you get another Supreme Court vacancy. Granted, that would take you back to an odd number, but it still creates another chance for a president to name a new nominee. Now, on the House side, that one I will predict, it will stay in Republican hands. Out of 435 seats, there are less than 20 that are viewed as competitive races. Out of 435, there's only about 20 that are competitive races. And because of the way districting's been done, you know, it still really favors, I think, a lot of the Republicans out there because of how the districts have been drawn up. So Republicans not going to lose the House this time around. Now, the change thing also comes into play here. It's hard to maintain the White House for more than 2 terms. No Democrat has ever succeeded a 2-term Democrat. Notice I inject that because FDR was more than a 2-term Democrat. But no Democrat has succeeded a 2-term president, a 2-term Democrat president since 1836. And outside of George H.W. Bush in 1988, for Republicans, haven't been one since 1904. So that tells you right there, it's awfully hard to keep the White House for 8 years and then add another 4 at least onto that.
All righty, let's give Roger a big round.
I don't think so. Thank you all very much.
All righty. Thank you, Roger.